There. Hey, Brenna, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really fantastic. Brenna Bell is the policy coordinator and staff attorney for BARC. She brings to her work a lifetime of passion for the Pacific Northwest and 20 years of organizing experience and an extensive background in environmental law and education. Her involvement in the Cascadia Forest Alliance and the campaign to save Eagle Creek led her to Lewis and Clark Law School, where she graduated cum laude. Brenna has worked with numerous nonprofits and is a co-founder of the Tryon Life Community Farm, a community sustainability education center. And she also lives and is raising her 2 children and many goats in Cedar Moon, the intentional community at TLC Farm. And we're looking forward to.
And what you may or may not know is I used to live with Matt at TLC Farm. So good to see you. And many of you, hi Lindsay, hi Leonard, many of you I haven't seen for a real long time. It's great to see other old farm folk here through the Zooms. We just finished our annual virtual open house at the farm. So that was fun to shift from that to this. And I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm thrilled that this group exists. My kids are older now. They're 11 and 16. But I remember that that organizing desert where it felt like everyone who was doing organizing was like 20 or 60, and there I was with my kids and where were my people? So I'm really excited that this group exists and that you've invited me to talk today. And I am going to do that share screen thing and show you pictures because I really like talking with pictures.
Actually, speaking of pictures, Brenna, while you do that, I realized I forgot to mention something really important for the kiddos on the call.
Okay.
So just, if you don't mind, I'm going to interject for just a minute.
Of course. The kids are the important ones.
So because we're talking about forests today, we thought it would be really fun for those of you who are sitting with your parents or your caregivers on this call, if you would like to draw a picture that represents something that you love about trees or forests, or just any thoughts or feelings that you have about trees and forests. And then when we're done with Brenna's presentation and our conversation, you can share those pictures with us. That sound good? Give me a thumbs up if that sounds good. Looks like someone already has a picture. All right, thanks so much. Okay, back to you, Brenna.
Thanks. And I want to start by saying that I'm speaking to you right now from land that is the traditional land of the Tualatin Kalapuya and the Clackamas Chinook, and that all of us are sitting somewhere on land of Indigenous people, land that was taken from them and where many of them still reside. And I think it's really important whenever we talk about ecology to remember that this is a landscape that has been imbued with human presence. Essentially, as long as this landscape has been there, since the ice retreated, people came and have lived in connection and in concert with this. And this is very important when we talk about fire, because fire is such an integral part to what shaped this landscape. And fire burned, Indigenous people used fire for tens of thousands of years in Oregon to shape what we call the wild. The forests were regularly burned to grow huckleberries, to grow bear grass, to create browse for deer and elk. And it was an incredibly important part of the cycle of the forest's life. Naturally lit fires with lightning strikes that were driven with wind were also a big part of this landscape. I think sometimes people have an idea that all of these fires are new, but we'll talk about how important fire has been to forests and continues to be. So a very short history is there was a massive exclusion of both tribal people and tribal practices between 100 and 150 years ago. And one of the things that led to was far less fire on the landscape because Indigenous burning all got stopped. And instead of having tribal management of the land, the Forest Service came and took the land that the tribes used to manage, put it under the management of the federal government, and started a process of full fire suppression and trying to get to stop all intentionally lit fires. So once there was a time when the people intentionally lit fires, and then we had things like Smokey the Bear being like, only you can prevent forest fires, with this message that any fire was bad. And the Forest Service started a policy they called the 10 a.m. policy, where they said that every single ignition needed to be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. So we went from a landscape that was regularly burned all throughout the forests to one where the dominant approach to fire was, it's bad, we have to stop it. You know, that's a super quick 100-year history, but there's a lot to say. So we got this mindset, the mindset that almost all of us were probably raised in, that, you know, the Smokey the Bear mindset, I like to call it, that fire is bad, we can stop it, and we should stop it. And, you know, the climate cooperated with the Forest Service and with that message. So here's a little chart that I really like, because it shows what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or the PDO, which is the shifts in the climate, right? You know, there's climate change, which is the big thing that we're experiencing that's happening because of too much carbon dioxide. But there's small climate changes, like climate wiggles throughout all time. And so in the last 100 years, we've had this climate wiggle where it was hot and dry from about 1900 to 1940. Right, that was a time that there was the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and there was a lot of drought in the land. And then from about 1940 to 1980, it got cool and wet. And you can see, if you look at this chart, it shows the millions of acres burned during those time periods. So there was a lot of fire when it was hot and dry. That makes sense, right? Hot and dry leads to fire. And then fire suppression and Smokey the Bear really got active after World War II. And they got helped by the climate. The climate was cool, the climate was moist, and people got it in their heads like, oh yeah, we actually can prevent forest fires. Not because they're really good at putting them out, but because it was cool and moist. And so the wood wasn't really wet, the burning period wasn't really long, and it was easy to put out. But now from the 80s on, we've been in this dry period where it's getting warmer and drier. And because of global climate change, we just expect it to become warmer and drier. So that means, as we've all experienced in our lifetimes, we're having more fire, right? I mean, I think all of us had that experience this year where there was just a lot of fire on the ground. So I'm going to talk very briefly, I'm trying to cram a lot of information in a short time, just about like, what is it that makes the fires happen? Like, why are they happening, and why are they so much bigger right now than they have been? So there's three main things, right? You need something to light the fire, right? And then you need something to burn, and then you need enough oxygen to keep it going. Like, anyone who's ever built a fire in your wood stove and a campfire, these three elements are the same no matter what fire you're building. So you need an ignition source, right? This year in the fires, a lot of them got ignited by power lines, which is another interesting way we can talk about that intersection of climate change and fighting climate change and forests. Is what in the world are all these power lines doing in the forest in the first place? It's like the way we use energy and generate energy and transport energy has a lot to do with whether or not there's an ignition source. The biggest one is fuel. Like, if you've ever built a fire, do you want really big, really wet pieces of wood to start your fire? No, it's really hard. I've done it. It's very hard to build a fire with big, wet pieces of wood. You want small pieces of wood. You want dry pieces of wood. Right? And if you look at this picture up here in the corner, that's an area after it's been logged to decrease fire risk, which happens, but what you see on the ground is a lot of dry kindling, right? But then the really big one is weather. Again, if you've built a fire and it's not really going, what do you want to do? You want to get air in there. You blow on it. You wave on it with a piece of cardboard or something. You want to get the wind into the fire to get it to move. And what we saw this year was the perfect combination of it being really hot and really dry, and then having there be a lot of wind. So one of the reasons we're having more fire is because we're having more drought. Just across the West, year after year, every summer is the hottest summer on record, and it's just building. And as it builds, each year, it's harder for those fuels for our forests to like moisten up. Think about a really dry sponge, right? It needs time in order to completely rehydrate. And that time for rehydration is shortening year after year after year. And so we have less and less and less water in our forests, stored in our forests, in the downed wood, in the moss, in the soil. That's all getting wicked away. And so a lot of people say, well, how is climate change really affecting fire behavior? The main way it is making the fuels drier for longer, right? So it's just the ability to burn extends longer than it used to. And then we have things like wind. Oh my gosh, this year we had what's called an east wind event, where warm wind comes over from the east side of the Cascades and blows across to the west side. Usually our wind comes from the Pacific, from the ocean. It's cool and moist wind. But every large fire that we've had some in 1920s and again in 1940s, they are all from these east wind events. So that combination, it's not about too many trees. It's about dry trees. It's about wind. And then they get an ignition source and whoosh, they burn. Now, I heard a very wise child say that fire is a natural part of the forest ecosystem, and you are exactly right. Like I said at the beginning, fires have always happened. Sometimes they were intentionally lit by people. Sometimes they happened because lightning struck and the conditions were just right with wind and fire, with wind and dry fuel to just make that fire move through the system. Now, fire was scary this year. It was really scary because a lot of people lost their houses. A lot of people not even in the forests, like our friends down in Southern Oregon, lost their houses as a fire just moved through the community. Fire is scary when it burns your house, but it's good when it burns in the forest. It rejuvenates the forest. It's part of the life cycle of the forest. You can see here 2 pictures. This is from the Eagle Creek fire. And this is only 1 year later, this picture on the after side. It only took 1 year for all those plants to grow back because the forest released a lot of nutrients when it did burn to help it grow. And you know, another thing, and I want to shift into here to talking about how cool trees are, because people wonder, well, didn't that fire put a whole bunch of carbon in the atmosphere, and should we worry about that if we're worried about climate change? Right? Good question. You see those huge plumes of smoke and you think, oh my goodness, the forest is totally burning up. All of that carbon is now in the atmosphere. Right? Well, it turns out that that's not true, which is great. Almost everything you see in that big plume of smoke is water with a little bit of particulate matter, because these trees are basically just releasing an enormous amount of steam, and they also burn the fine fuels like leaves and needles. But do you know where most of the carbon in a tree is? Think about a tree, right? Where does most of the carbon live? Anyone have a guess? Even an adult can answer.
In the trunk.
In the trunk, that's right. And is the trunk still there after the fire? Yes, see, I've got a picture. There it is. So almost all of the carbon in a tree is either in the trunk or underground in the root system, right? And so those are all still in place after a fire. And not only are they in place, but that charcoal, like you see here, is one of the most stable forms of carbon. And so it actually makes the trees with their carbon even more stable because it takes so long to break down. Usually, I can talk about even how live trees are so cool with carbon, right? Because they are not just storing it, right? A dead tree stores carbon. It just holds the carbon in place. But a live tree sequesters carbon or sucks it out of the air, right? So those live trees are just sucking the carbon dioxide out of the air and transforming it into their trunks and their roots and their leaves. And they're also, outbreathing some of it, like the slow process of decomposition, but on the whole, they're just pulling it out of the air and pulling it out of the air. And that is super important because right now we have way too much carbon in the air, right? The goal is 350 parts per million. And I think we're at some place like 412 parts per million. So we're at a place where it's not enough just to stop more carbon from getting into the air, right? We can't just try and stop fossil fuel pollution. We need to think about solutions that pull existing carbon out of the air. And that's why trees are so awesome, because naturally they do it. And not only do trees do that, we live in one of the best places in the entire world for trees that are good at pulling carbon out of the air and storing them. So this little map shows the top 10 carbon storing national forests in the country. And Mount Hood, which is the one that we're right by, is number 6, only because it's smaller than the Willamette, which is number 1 because it's so big. And it just shows that, like, for the whole nation, our ecosystem is super duper good at pulling carbon out of the air and turning it into forests. And the good news is we could be doing even better. There's been a lot of people who have been starting to study the ability of these forests to sequester carbon and store it. And they found that we could actually double the carbon stores in the Pacific Northwest forests if we stopped cutting down old growth trees and stopped logging in national forests and allowed the trees to grow old longer. Oh, look, I have a slide saying that. So, see that really big tree and that really little kid? For the most part, those trees have been protected, but not totally. The Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management on federal public lands are still targeting old growth in timber sales. They're going into areas that have been just recently burned in these last fires, and they're cutting down those trees that are holding that really nice, stable carbon. They're cutting them down and sending them to the mill, which will release most of that carbon back into the atmosphere. And those forests are some of our best allies for decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so one of the things that I do is I really work to get people to understand the role of forests in helping mitigate climate change, and also understanding the role of fire in helping transform these forests, but how climate change is making fires worse. So the most important thing we can do is keep our trees standing, because some people, especially some people in the logging industry, keep trying to tell us that if we just cut the trees down, then they wouldn't burn, and that would be okay, that would be better. But it's not better. Yeah. And so the thing is that we need the trees need fire, and we all just need to learn how to live together a little bit better. So I wanted to end with, questions and discussion, because I just rapidly told you a lot of things, but really reminding us that what just happened in the fires in Oregon was just devastating to communities. And I consider it a humanitarian crisis. And as people keep thinking like, well, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? How do we keep this from happening again? Really, the best way is to help communities become more resilient in the face of fire, because fires are going to happen. They're natural. They have always happened, and because of climate change, they're going to continue to happen. We can't actually stop them, but we can prepare for them. We can put money into home hardening, into protecting around communities, into community preparedness and emergency systems. And I think that's one of the things that we're asking you to do in terms of an action is reach out to our senators and
Brenna, I think we lost your audio.
then questions. And sorry, I've got this little thing on my headset that if I accidentally touch it, it just kills my audio, and I accidentally touched it.
No worries. Glad we can hear you now. Thank you. Yeah, so let's just do some conversation, question and answer, and then we'll move on to introducing this letter writing action that we're going to do together. Thank you so much, Brenna. That was super informative and really interesting. I learned some things I didn't know before.
Thanks, a little whirlwind through forest fire and climate policy.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yeah, Nora.
You know, this is sort of a general question, but you know, as a lover of forests and like not wanting to cut old growth trees and wanting to help our forests store more carbon and protect biodiversity and you know, protect our waters, and then also recognizing that like our houses are built out of wood, and like, you know, wood is also a renewable resource that's we build so much stuff out of. And I guess like I don't know much about, I'm looking for a resource that could help me learn more about like what truly sustainable logging, like wood as a resource management would look like, because it seems like we're not doing that, but we need to do that because we're not going to stop using wood. So is there something that you could recommend us or me to look into about that?
Yeah, there actually are a lot of small woodlot owners in Oregon who are like family woodlot owners who have shifted or have always done more sustainable woodlot management. The one that comes to my mind just off the top of my head is called Hyla Woods. It's Hyla Woods. And they do a lot of training for other woodlot owners. I think one of the big issues is, I mean, just bluntly capitalism and profit. And a lot of the trees that are logged just to get the quickest return. A lot of the private forests in Oregon after the recession were sold to Wall Street hedge funds. It's one of the reasons we're seeing so many more clear cuts on the Coast Range now. And so a lot of the management is just completely profit driven. And people who do, who really care for their land are able to keep it in sustained rotation. That's just unfortunately not how most people do it. We also see a lot of our wood in the United States exported. There's massive wood exports in Oregon and Washington, especially to Asia, across the Pacific. And people have tried to just decrease that so we are not logging our forests for foreign use, and also trying to decrease the amount of waste that happens. I mean, just think about pallets. You know, I once saw a study that said that if we stopped using one-time only pallets, we could stop all logging on national forests and not have any impact on the rest of the wood stream. That's just pallets. So all of those like one-time uses lead to this. There has been a big push to stop commercial logging on public lands, which is honestly a very small amount of the wood that's used, but a very large amount of the biodiversity and old growth. And I think we're going to continue to do that. I might be back asking you all to help. There's a bunch of groups who are trying to push an executive order in the new administration that would immediately stop logging mature and old growth forests in the West because of climate issues. And we're going to start looking for support on that in January and February. So if we could just protect that even, that would be really, really helpful. Yeah, I see a question from Jan.
Thank you. This is all awesome. I have a few, but I'll just start with one question that your last statement made me think of from my work with Bark years ago. I remember learning a lot about these topics, and one of the suggestions, so I wonder what your thoughts are about this on public lands. Um, do you think it's worth advocating for thinning the small trees? And like one of the barriers, it kind of relates to Nora's question, was that mills weren't really couldn't accommodate small diameter trees, and that would be another kind of opportunity. But I know there's a lot to be said for just a zero cut. But at the same time, we do have a little tinderbox. So just that, and then a couple others if time allows and there aren't other questions.
Yeah, well, I will say almost all the mills have retooled because there aren't as many big trees anymore. So the small tree, that's just not as much of an issue. And on the east side of the forest where fire has been really excluded, we've been, actually not, I wouldn't say supporting the Forest Service, but not objecting to the Forest Service moving forward and doing some even commercial thinning of trees so they feel comfortable enough to get fire back in the ecosystem. For a large part, the forest, can regulate itself. And typically when there's a profit motive for logging, they end up wanting to take the big trees, right? And so that's the challenge, because there's a lot of money in big trees and there's not a lot in small trees. But there is a place for thinning and restoration, especially where fire has been excluded. And I see a question over here from Caleb and Eva. See a hand up.
Is there still carbon in the house, in your house, because it's made of wood?
Yes. You absolutely can store carbon in your house. It's made of wood, and everything that's made of wood stores carbon in it. The one thing I will say is that you'll store more carbon in the tree than you do in the wood, right? Because the tree has the roots that go down into the soil, and it has all the branches, and all of that stuff gets lost and either burned, well, actually usually just burned, and then puts that carbon into the air. So you do store some carbon from that tree in your house. I'm pointing right now to my wood table that you can't see. And it's great to be able to do that. But when people say we should cut the trees and turn them into houses and tables to store the carbon, to store more carbon, they're forgetting that we lose about half or more of the carbon along the way. And most things actually don't end up in long-lived wood products. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Matt?
Hi, Brenna. It's so nice to see you.
You too.
I was curious if you are seeing any change in either like state or national approaches to fire management and in kind of taking into account these sort of more frequent and more larger wildfires that we're seeing, and or if you all at Bark are advocating in terms of different fires. Sounds like you're doing some of that different fire approach management.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, we're not seeing it quite yet. It feels like we're just on the cusp of things changing. There's been an enormous amount of discussion and policy creation and things that recognize that fires are a natural part of the ecosystem, and we shouldn't try and put every single thing out. Like full suppression intellectually is a thing of the past. However, on the books, like our forest plan for Mount Hood is 30 years old, and it still calls for full suppression of every ignition, right? And the district rangers and the forest supervisors still feel personally liable for every fire. And so they are very, very wary to do something like wildland fire use, where they could be like, oh, actually this fire is like the White River fire on the east side this year. It was an amazingly good fire. It was a natural fire ignition. It burned really low severity. It wasn't weather driven. And they spent about $20 million trying to put it out. And they never put it out fully. The weather changed and put it out. That's $20 million that honestly didn't need to be spent and totally could have been put into more proactive work. And so it's like, it's just starting to shift. And then fires like the ones on the west side, they just couldn't put those out. Like there was just no way, right? those weather-driven fires, you couldn't do anything. And so people are starting to understand that our idea that we can control fire behavior is wrong-headed, but it's just having the hardest time catching up with what really happens. There is a huge fire industrial economy. There is so much money in putting fires out. There's an entire industry built up around it. And even though most people know it doesn't work, that is having a hard time changing it. If people want to geek out on this stuff at all, there's a group we work with a lot called FUSI, Firefighters United for Sustainability, Ethics, and Ecology. And they talk a ton about the wrong-headed approach to firefighting. It's all old wildland firefighters, and they are trying to change it policy by policy. They're an awesome group. It's FUSEE.org.
Thanks so much, Brenna. I saw Abe had his hand up, and then I'm wondering, Brenna, if you would be willing to tell us just a little bit about the Wildfire Defense Act, and then we'll hand it over to Nora to tell us about the letter writing action we have planned. And then we can have some time for kiddos who drew pictures to share them with us. Does that sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to take, so let's go to Abe, and then if anyone else has any last questions or comments.
Well, I was wondering if the first fire could burn like 2 towns in a row.
Yes, actually it could. And the fires that just happened did. There were fires that were in the Santiam Canyon that burned a lot of towns, not all the way down. And honestly, those fires mostly didn't happen because the fire swept out of the forest, but there was forest all around them. And then their power lines started going down, and it sparked fires that just zipped through the town. When the wind is strong enough, the fires can burn pretty much anything. And the best you can hope for is to have a metal roof and a lot of luck. And a good emergency preparedness.
One more question.
Sure, honey. Okay.
If people lived in trees, would there be more carbon around them?
If people lived in trees, well, there's carbon around us all the time in the atmosphere. It's just the type of carbon, right? Like if you can imagine, if you lived in the forest, every tree is a huge stick of carbon, reaching way up into the sky and way down in the ground. Now, if you live in a wood house, you are surrounded by carbon, but it's kind of like an empty block of carbon, right? And not a lot of exciting things is going with the carbon coming out of the atmosphere and into your house and out. It's just like a kind of dead block of carbon. I think, yes, if people lived in trees, they would be more surrounded by carbon than we are now, even if we live in wood houses. My best answer to the question. And I will just mention the action that y'all are about to do. So kind of to Matt's question on what is the government doing about all this, right? Right after the fires, all politicians wanted to do something. They wanted to make things better. And unfortunately, one of the approaches that's been out there for a long time is this idea that what we need to do is go log trees in the backcountry, because if there's fewer trees, then we won't have these fires, which is just not true. It just doesn't work. I mean, if there's a really low severity fire that happens in a place that was very recently logged and burned, it might have less of an impact. But the fires that we worry about are the ones that are wind driven, not fuels driven, right? Those are the big ones. Those are the scary ones. Those are the ones that burn down towns. Those don't get affected at all by fuels treatment. So there were 2 bills that we're talking about. One from Senator Feinstein and Dane says, let's use all this money and go log in the backcountry. And the other from soon-to-be Vice President Harris says, let's actually focus on communities and give them the resources they need to do good community wildfire planning. And that's the one we like. And it just makes sense. It's like the communities that plan for tornadoes or hurricanes. Like you don't try and put them out, you plan for them. And we need to start thinking of big fires as a weather event, a climate event, not something that's controllable. And the best thing we can do is prepare. So we're asking our senators in Oregon to say no to go out and doing more backcountry logging and to say yes to more community preparedness. Those two different bills.
And I can just jump in and say that we have a letter for you all to print out and send to Senators Wyden and Merkley. And I think Katie's going to drop a link to the Google Doc in the chat, and we'll also email it to you after the call. And to Senator Merkley, we're asking him to support the bill that would fund and enable communities to, work on their emergency preparedness and community resilience, and to reject the bill that would log in the backcountry. And then because Senator Wyden actually is already supporting the good bill, we're thanking him for supporting it, and we're asking him to reject the bill that would log more. And we left it's a very, of course these things are complex, so it's a very condensed amount of information, but the two things that we wanted to do was we left a space for you to write in a few sentences as to why these bills are important to you, why they matter to you, why you care about forests and fire. And there's a second page, which is for any children or young people in your life, for them to also write to their senators and to say their name and how old they are and why they care about protecting forests, and there's space for them to do some drawing or painting or any kind of artwork. And I will say that in my brief career experience in terms of like lobbying in Oregon, what I have heard from more seasoned organizers and activists and from like legislative staff, who are the ones that like actually get all of the things that people send them, in terms of having an impact on our elected officials, really the most effective thing you can do is to send something physical in the mail that's personalized and comes from the heart, and especially children's artwork. They get, those sort of like form emails that you send are not that impactful. That would be like the least impactful thing. A voicemail is definitely more, but I think like and a personalized email, but this is sort of probably one of the more impactful things that you can do to communicate with your elected officials. And we've tried to make it as easy as possible and to provide an opportunity for your children to participate as well. So thank you so much for hopefully doing that, and also for sharing with other friends and family who you think would be willing to be active on this particular issue. Lindsay says, is writing in your own words even potentially more impactful? I think yes, and I think that's why we wanted to leave a space on this letter for you to add your own sort of few sentences, in your own words, straight from your heart.
Yeah, and even if you don't want to use this form letter at all and you'd rather just entirely write your own letter, that's fantastic. We just created a form letter, recognizing that oftentimes starting from scratch and writing your own letter can feel a little daunting or just time intensive. So yeah, the more personal, the better. And kiddos, I don't know if you heard that, but there's a spot on this letter where you can draw a picture to the senators. And when you do that, it really helps them pay closer attention to the letter, because they get a lot of letters, but they don't get letters with pictures from kids very often. And so I think it would be a big help if you want to include a letter or a note. I mean, a drawing or a note if you want to. Yeah, any questions on this letter?
What?
Is that us?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Would we be able to like who would they go to exactly? Like, I was sort of wondering if it would go to the president or vice president.
It's who our senators,
Oh,
Joe.
okay,
Yeah, yeah, they make the laws. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, it's going to go to our 2 senators at the US Senate for our state of Oregon. So that's Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden. Yeah, any other questions or comments on this? Cool. Well, we will send this as a PDF in a follow-up email to this conversation. And I will also, I realize I didn't put it in the Google Drive yet, but I will, before we wrap up here, I'll also just put a link in the chat box so you can open it up right away if you'd like. And the easiest thing to do would just be to print it and use the address on there to mail it. And if you don't have a printer, definitely feel free to write your own version of the letter. You can make it shorter or longer, however you'd like. And there isn't is there a sort of time frame, Brenna, when like receiving this would be, most advantageous for them?
Before everyone forgets about the fires. I mean, They are a little distracted right now with a few other things. Like Senator Harris is about to be vice president, but that is one of the reasons we're really hoping that Ron Wyden will step up as a key sponsor for this. So the earlier the better, honestly. But there's no votes that are coming right up.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank you so much, Brenna, for joining us today. It was really such a pleasure to see you and hear from you.
My pleasure.
And, we're really excited to be diving into more forest advocacy work and also community education around the intersection between forests and trees and wildfire and climate. So we're excited to continue to work with BARC. And if y'all aren't familiar with BARC, their website is bark-out.org. And Brenna and her team over there are doing some really fantastic work to protect the Mount Hood.
And I'm already thinking about when we all can be in the forest again, maybe having a co-led hike where we do family-oriented hike in the forest. We tried to do that always for our Mother's Day hike, except I never wanted to go because it's Mother's Day and I didn't want to work. So maybe we can do another one a different time. It would be really fun to do a kid-focused hike with you all. And good to see you. So many of you I have seen over the years and haven't seen in a while. But I'm going to bounce now, and y'all take care.
Thanks so much, Brenna. We'll be in touch.